She did not fall. She was pushed, and the hands that sent her over the edge of that stone balcony, the hands still warm from the morning fire, still smelling of lavender and powder, belonged to the one person in all the world she had trusted with her life. Her sister. Natalya Vorrenskaya did scream as she fell because it was quite painful. She knows that screaming only gave her sister satisfaction, which she couldn't help. She hit the lower roof, then the garden wall, then the cold earth, and when she opened her eyes, the sky above her was pale and indifferent, the way it always was in this part of England, as though even the heavens had agreed not to interfere. By nightfall, she was not in a hospital. She was not in her own bed. She was in the attic, boarded in, bolted shut, with nothing but the dark, the dust, and the distant sound of a grand estate carrying on without her music, laughter, crystal glasses meeting in toasts she would never hear the reason for. No one came. No one asked where she had gone. And the story that was told downstairs in the drawing rooms, at the dinner table, over the finest silver, was that Natalya had left, quietly, willingly, as girls like her sometimes do. But on the 43rd night, something changed. A carriage arrived at Vorrenskaya Hall that no one had been expecting, and the man who stepped out of it was not the kind of man you kept waiting, not the kind of man you lied to without consequence. They called him the Duke of Ashenvael, and from somewhere above the rafters, through a crack in the boards no wider than a finger, a single sound escaped into the frozen night air. A cry. Whether he heard it, whether he was the one meant to hear it, that we do not yet know. If you are Natalya Vorrenskaya, what will you do? Drop it in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. And if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit the subscribe button. We are just getting started. The 43rd night was the coldest one yet. Natalya Vorrenskaya had stopped counting the days by scratching marks into the wall. She had done that in the beginning, when she still believed someone would come, when she still pressed her ear to the boards and listened for footsteps that never arrived. Now she simply knew, the way the body knows things, the mind has given up arguing about, that it had been a long time. Long enough that the bruises from the fall had faded from deep purple to a sickly yellow and then to nothing at all. Long enough that the hunger had stopped feeling sharp and started feeling like a permanent companion, something dull and familiar that sat beside her in the dark and asked for nothing. She was 22 years old. She had once been called the more beautiful of the Vorrenskaya sisters. She did not think about that anymore. What she thought about, in the long hours between the thin grey light of dawn and the absolute black of midnight, was how it had happened, not the fall itself. She had made peace with the fall. What she could not make peace with was the moment before it, the moment when Serafina had looked at her across the stone balcony railing, and there had been nothing in her eyes, not hatred, not guilt, not even the cold satisfaction Natalya might have expected from a woman who had spent years sharpening herself against her. There had been nothing, a blank and quiet decision. The way you look at a door before you close it. That was the thing that lived with Natalya in the dark, not the pain, the nothing. Serafina Vorrenskaya was 2 years older, half an inch taller, and had been the favourite from the moment their father first held them both and decided, in the wordless arithmetic of men like him, which daughter was worth more. Natalya had grown up in the shadow of that decision. She had learned to read in that shadow, learned to speak French and play the pianoforte, and carry herself through a room with the kind of quiet dignity that people noticed but never quite knew how to name. She had done everything right. She had smiled when it was required and been silent when silence was safer, and had never, not once, given Serafina a reason to do what she did. And Serafina had done it anyway, because the reason had nothing to do with Natalya. It had to do with Lord Casimir Drevich, the man their father had promised to Natalya in a private arrangement made before either of them knew what such arrangements meant. A man of moderate fortune and considerable land, not remarkable in any particular way, but enough to secure a future, enough to give Natalya something of her own. And Serafina, who had always taken what she wanted with both hands, had decided that was not acceptable. So, on the morning of the 14th of November, while the rest of the house was occupied with preparations for the evening's supper, Serafina had walked Natalya out onto the east balcony under the pretense of admiring the frost on the garden hedges. She had said something about the cold, something about the light, and then she had placed both hands flat against Natalya's back and pushed. The rest had been gravity. Natalya had not died, which she suspected had not been part of the original plan. She had hit the lower roof and rolled and fallen again, and landed in the frozen garden bed against the east wall, and she had lain there for a long time, while the sky went from white to grey to dark. And then Serafina's maid had come not to help, but to carry her, half-conscious and unable to resist, through the servants' entrance and up the back staircase and into the attic, where a lock had been fitted to the outside of the door, with what Natalya could only conclude was considerable foresight. The story downstairs was that she had gone to stay with a cousin in the country, quietly, without fuss. As Natalya so often did things, Serafina had apparently told their father because she was always the quieter one, was she not? Their father had believed it. That was perhaps the part that hurt most. Not the boards across the small attic window. Not the cold that came up through the floor, no matter how tightly she wrapped herself in the one thin blanket she had been left with. It was that her father had heard the explanation and returned to his newspaper. She had screamed in the first days, long and hard and without dignity. She had pounded on the door until her hands bled and thrown the chamber pot against the wall and pressed her mouth to every gap in the board she could find and screamed until her throat gave out. No one had come. The servants knew. She understood that now. The ones who might have helped had been paid or replaced, and the ones who remained were Serafina's entirely. So she had stopped screaming. She had wrapped herself in the blanket and sat in the corner where the roof met the floor, and she had thought about every practical thing she knew: how to stay warm, how to sleep in short intervals so the cold never fully took hold, how to eat the small amounts of bread and water that appeared once a day through the slot cut low in the door, just large enough for a plate to pass through and small enough to remind her what she was. She did not cry. Crying spent heat she could not afford. What she did instead was think and plan, and hold on to the single sharp point of certainty that had lodged itself in her chest like a splinter she could not reach, that Serafina had made an error. Not the error of cruelty. Cruelty, Natalya had long understood, was its own kind of logic. The error was simpler and more fatal than that. Serafina had left her alive. On the 43rd night, Natalya was sitting in her corner when she heard the carriage. She knew the sound of every carriage that used the North Drive. She had catalogued them over the weeks the way a prisoner catalogues the sounds of their world when the world has been reduced to sounds. She knew the heavy roll of her father's landau, the lighter step of the Drevich horses, the creak of the delivery cart on Thursdays. This carriage she did not know. The wheels were heavier, the horses were more, and the sound of it stopping in front of the house had a different quality, not the easy arrival of a familiar guest, but something that made the house itself seem to hold still for a moment. She moved to the crack in the boards. She had found it on the 4th night, a gap where two planks had warped slightly apart in the upper left corner of the boarded window. It was narrow, the width of 2 fingers, but it faced the front of the estate, and it was enough to see the gravel drive and, on clear nights, the outline of the stone gateposts at the end of the long approach. She pressed her eye to the gap. The carriage was black, not the fashionable black of a well-maintained town vehicle, but a deep, serious black, the black of something that had travelled long distances and did not apologize for it. The crest on the door was not one she recognized from this distance, but the horses, 4 of them, all dark, were the kind that cost more than most men earned in a year. A footman descended first, then another, and then, after a pause that felt deliberate, the man himself stepped down. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall in a way that was not simply height but bearing, the kind of presence that takes up more space than the body physically occupies. He wore a dark coat and no hat, which was unusual in the cold, and his hair was black and cut short in the way of a man who has no patience for fashion. He stood for a moment in the gravel drive and looked up at the house with an expression she could not read from where she was, and she had the sudden and irrational feeling that he was not here for any of the reasons guests usually came to Vorrenskaya Hall. He was not here for supper. He was not here for business. He was here for something the house would not want to give him. One of the lower servants was already at the front steps, visibly flustered in the particular way that meant whoever had arrived was someone the household had not prepared for. Natalya watched the footman lean toward the servant, say something short, and hand over a card. The servant looked at it, and the fluster became something else entirely. Natalya did not know his name yet. She would learn it within the hour, when the sound of it reached her through the floor in fragments, passed between anxious voices she could hear but not fully assemble. She would catch one word clearly, in the sharp silence that followed the first rush of whispered conversation from the room below. She pressed her ear to the floor and listened, and somewhere beneath her, the house that had pretended she did not exist began, very quietly, to panic. She pressed her mouth to the crack in the boards and breathed the cold outside air and did not make a sound. Not yet. She had learned what screaming cost. She had learned to be still and wait and choose the right moment with the precision of someone who understood in the marrow of her bones that she would not get a second one. The voices below grew louder. She closed her eyes and waited. If you're still with me till this moment, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. I truly appreciate you for sticking around. The name came to her in pieces. She heard it first from the housekeeper, Mrs. Boldover, whose voice carried through the ceiling boards like smoke through old wood, low and fast, and threaded with something Natalya had never once heard in that woman's voice in all the years she had known her. Fear. Not the fear of a servant who has made a mistake, the deeper kind, the kind that comes from suddenly understanding the size of what is standing in your house. The Duke of Ashenvael. Natalya pressed her palm flat against the floor and felt the vibration of footsteps below, heavy, unhurried. The walk of a man who has never once needed to rush because the world has always rearranged itself ahead of him. She did not know the name Ashenvael. That in itself was significant. She had grown up in a household where names were currency and titles were memorized before a girl was old enough to understand why. Her father had been meticulous about that. You will know every family of consequence in this country, and half of those on the continent, he had told her once, because knowledge is the only inheritance I can guarantee you. She had taken that seriously. She had built in her mind a careful architecture of names and connections and histories, and she had never once encountered Ashenvael, which meant either the dukedom was very old and very quiet, or the man who held it had made a deliberate practice of being unknown. Neither possibility was comforting. She heard Serafina's voice then, smooth and measured in the way it always was, when she was performing for someone she considered worth the performance. Natalya knew that voice the way she knew the cold. She had grown up beside it. She had watched it work on their father, on servants, on suitors who came to the house full of confidence and left somehow rearranged. Serafina had a gift for making people feel that what she wanted was, in fact, what they had always wanted too. It was not charm exactly. Charm implied warmth. This was something colder and more precise. She was using it now. Natalya could not hear the words clearly, but she could hear the shape of them, welcoming, gracious, faintly apologetic, in the way that suggests the apology is a favour being extended rather than a debt being paid. She was managing him the way she managed everything, from the first moment of contact. There was a pause, and then a voice she had not heard before said something in response that was too low for Natalya to catch, and the quality of the silence that followed was unlike anything she had heard from below in 43 nights. Serafina did not fill it. That was the thing. Serafina always filled silence. Silence was a void she treated as a personal affront, something to be covered and smoothed over and made hospitable as quickly as possible. But whatever he had said had left her without words, and the pause stretched out long enough that Natalya found herself holding her breath. She thought about the man she had seen from the crack in the boards, the dark coat, the absence of a hat, the way he had looked up at the house with that expression she could not name. She had met men of consequence before. She had sat across dinner tables from lords and baronets and the occasional earl, and she had observed, with the careful attention of someone who understood she was always being assessed and so had better be assessing back, that power in men usually announced itself. It wore itself on the outside, in the set of the jaw, in the particular way of entering a room that said, "I have arrived, and now the room may begin." This man had not announced himself. He had simply been present, and somehow that was worse. She shifted on the cold floor and pressed her eye back to the crack in the boards. She could see the top of the staircase from this angle, just barely, through the narrow gap. She watched a candle pass below, and then Serafina's pale hand on the banister, and then nothing, as they moved deeper into the house and out of her limited line of sight. She sat back, and in the silence that followed she did something she had not done in weeks. She let herself remember. Not the fall, not the attic, before that. She let herself remember what she had been. She had been, by any reasonable account, happy. Not the extravagant happiness of novels, not the flushed and breathless kind that girls were taught to wait for, but a quieter and more durable version. She had been happy in the library on winter mornings, with a book she had already read 3 times. She had been happy in the kitchen garden in late summer, her hands in the soil, the cook's daughter beside her, both of them speaking in the uncomplicated way of people who are not trying to be anything for each other. She had been happy in a careful and private way. When Casimir Dravech had sat across from her at her father's table and looked at her not as an asset to be acquired, but as a person he was genuinely curious about, he had asked her opinion on things. Small things at first, and then larger ones. He had listened when she answered. That was rarer than it should have been. She had not loved him. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, even now. She had been on the early edge of something that might have grown into love, something with good bones and a solid foundation, and she had thought that was enough. That was more than most women she knew had been offered. Serafina had taken it. She had taken Casimir the way she took everything, not out of desire but out of principle, the principle being that anything Natalya had was, by definition, something Serafina should have instead. Natalya understood that now, in a way she had not understood it while it was happening. While it was happening, she had explained it to herself in softer terms. Rivalry, jealousy. The ordinary friction of two sisters too close in age and too different in temperament. She had been generous in her interpretation, because generosity had always felt like the more dignified response. The attic had cured her of generosity. She had spent 43 nights with nothing but the truth for company, and she had looked at it from every angle, and she had arrived without drama and without pleasure at a very simple conclusion. Serafina did not want Casimir. Serafina wanted Natalya to have nothing. There was a difference. One was greed. The other was something she did not have a polite word for. She pressed her forehead against her knees. She was not, by nature, a bitter person. She had worked hard not to be, had watched bitterness take hold in other women around her, and had recognized it for what it was, a reasonable response to unreasonable conditions, and had also recognized that it cost more than it returned. But in the dark and the cold, with the thin blanket pulled around her shoulders and the distant sound of crystal and candlelight below, she felt something shift, not into bitterness exactly, into something harder, something that had edges. She thought about the Duke. She thought about the way the house had reacted to him, and the way Serafina's voice had lost its footing, and the way he had stood in the gravel drive, as though he was not a visitor, but a reckoning. She did not know why he was here. She did not know what business he had with her family, or whether he knew she existed, or whether any of this had anything to do with her at all. It almost certainly did not. Men like that did not come to houses like this for the benefit of girls locked in attics. That was not how the world worked, and she had never been naive enough to believe otherwise. But the house was afraid of him, and that meant he had something the house needed, or knew something the house was hiding, or was something the house could not simply manage and redirect and absorb, the way it had absorbed everything else, including her. She unfolded herself slowly from the corner, her joints stiff with cold, and stood. She stood in the dark attic, and she breathed slowly, and she thought about what she knew and what she needed, and what a woman in her position could reasonably do. She had a voice. She had a crack in the boards. She had a house full of people who were currently distracted by the presence of a man none of them had been prepared for. She had waited 43 nights. She moved to the window before she had fully decided to, before the careful and self-preserving part of her could raise its objections. She moved to the crack in the boards, and she pressed her mouth to it, and she thought about the sound that would carry and the sound that would not, and she thought about the cold night air outside and whether it would reach the drive. And then she thought about Serafina's hands, flat against her back, and the nothing in her eyes. She drew a long breath. The cry that left her was not the wild and broken sound of the early days. It was not desperation. It had been refined by 43 nights into something more precise. It was a sound with intention behind it, controlled and clear and aimed, the way you aim something you have only one of, at a target you cannot afford to miss. Whether it carried, she did not know. Whether the man in the house below paused in whatever conversation he was being carefully steered through and raised his head and looked toward the ceiling, she did not know. She pressed her back against the wall beneath the window and slid down to the floor and waited. And the house, below her, went very still. The stillness did not last. She heard it break from below in stages, the way ice breaks on a river, first a sound too small to name, then a crack, then the whole surface giving way at once. A chair moved. Footsteps crossed the room beneath her with a different quality than before, Not the measured pace of a man being shown through a house, but something more direct, something that had changed direction. Natalya stayed on the floor and did not move. She had made the sound. She had sent it out into the night, and she had no way of knowing what it had reached, or what it had set in motion. And the part of her that had spent 43 nights learning to be careful was now running a very cold and very rapid assessment of what happened if it had reached the wrong person first. If Serafina had heard it, if the maid had heard it, if the sound had been intercepted and explained away before it ever got close to the man in the dark coat. Serafina was good at that, intercepting, explaining, making the truth sound like a misunderstanding. The footsteps below stopped, then voices, low and fast. She could not separate them at first. They came in layers. Mrs. Boldover and at least one footman and Serafina, all speaking at the same time in the compressed and urgent way of people trying to solve a problem before someone else notices it exists. She pressed her ear harder to the floor and caught fragments. Nothing significant. Wind through old timber, the house settling. These old estates make all manner of sounds in the cold. Your Grace, I do hope it has not disturbed you, please. The drawing-room is warm. Then silence. A different silence this time. Not the silence of a room that has gone quiet, but the silence of a room from which someone has left. Natalya straightened. She moved to the door and pressed her palm flat against it and listened with her whole body, the way she had learned to listen in the weeks when listening was the only tool she had. She heard the servants' passage below. She heard a door open somewhere in the middle of the house and close again. She heard Serafina's voice, closer now, coming up the main staircase, and the tone of it had changed. The performance was gone. What was left was the real voice, the one Natalya had grown up with, stripped of its softness, precise as a blade. She was telling someone to stay where they were. She was telling someone that there was nothing upstairs worth seeing. She was telling someone, in the particular way she had of making instructions sound like generous advice, that the east wing was closed for the season and the upper floors were in a state of repair, and it would really be better, far better, if they remained in the drawing-room where the fire was lit and the wine was good and the evening could continue as planned. There was a pause, and then a voice said, simply, that it preferred to see for itself. Natalya had only heard that voice once, too low and too far away to catch the words. She caught them now. He was closer. He was on the stairs. And the quality of his voice was not what she had expected from a man of his rank. It was not the broad and self-satisfied sound of English aristocracy accustomed to being agreed with. It was quieter than that, more contained. The voice of someone who had learned that volume was unnecessary when you were the kind of person no one argued with for long. Serafina said something sharp and low that Natalya could not catch. He did not respond. The footsteps continued up the stairs. Natalya pressed her back against the wall beside the door and breathed through her nose and thought with absolute clarity about what came next. If he found the door, he would find the lock. If he found the lock, he would find it unusual. If he found it unusual, he might ask questions, and if he asked questions in the right direction, with enough authority behind them that the servants could not simply redirect him, then something might shift. Something might actually shift. But Serafina was not going to let him find the door. She heard it then, the sound of her sister moving ahead of him on the landing, managing the geography of the house the way she managed everything, with apparent hospitality and absolute control. Showing him a window, pointing toward the garden, drawing his attention outward and away with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent a lifetime ensuring that whatever she did not want seen remained unseen. Natalya looked at the door. The lock was on the outside. That had never changed. But the door itself was old, and the frame was older, and in the weeks she had spent in this room, she had learned every weakness in every board, the way you learn the rules of a place that holds you. She knew that the lower left panel had a crack running through it that spread further every time the temperature dropped. She knew that the frame on the hinge side had softened with damp, and that the screws holding the top hinge to the wood were not biting as deep as they once had. She had known these things for weeks. She had not acted on them because acting required a reason, a real one, not just desperation, but timing. And she had learned that desperation without timing was just noise. She looked at the crack under the door, and she thought about the man on the other side of it, currently being redirected by her sister toward a window that looked out over a garden that told him nothing. And she thought about the distance between where he was and where she was, and whether that distance was about to become fixed. She made a decision. She crossed the room to the corner where the chamber pot stood and picked up the small wooden stool beside it, the only piece of furniture in the room aside from the rolled blanket on the floor. And she turned back to the door and she hit the lower panel 3 times, hard, with the leg of the stool. The sound was not large, but in a quiet house, on a landing where 2 people were currently standing in a silence full of things being left unsaid, it did not need to be large. It needed only to be distinct. She heard Serafina speak immediately, quick and bright, something about the pipes in this part of the house. So unreliable, the housekeeper has been after them for months. Shall we go back down? And she heard beneath that brightness the first genuine crack in her sister's composure, thin as a fault line, but real. And she struck the panel again. The footsteps on the landing stopped moving away. They stopped. Natalya pressed herself to the wall beside the door and waited. And in the space between one breath and the next, she understood something with complete and sudden clarity. That this was the moment she had spent 43 nights moving toward without knowing it. That everything she had endured, the cold and the dark and the hunger and the systematic erasure of her existence from the life of her own house, had been building toward this precise point in time. This man, on the other side of this door, she did not know him. She did not know why he was here, or what he wanted, or whether he was a good man or merely a powerful one, and she understood in the clearest part of herself that those were not the same thing. But he was here, and he had heard her, and he had stopped. A hand tried the door from outside. It did not open because it was locked, and the lock held, and for one terrible second she felt the whole fragile possibility of the moment begin to slide. Then she heard Serafina's voice, close now, very close, saying something about the old servants' quarters and disuse, and she would have the key sent up in the morning. It was really nothing. And she heard the brittleness in it, the almost imperceptible tremor that only someone who had listened to that voice for 22 years would catch. Serafina was afraid. Natalya pressed her mouth to the gap at the edge of the doorframe, the narrow place where the old wood had warped away from the wall, and she said one word. She did not shout it. She did not beg with it. She said it the way she had learned to say things in the attic, stripped of everything unnecessary, precise and aimed and cold as the air outside. She said, "Help." The silence on the other side of the door lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted them, and then there was a sound she had not been prepared for. Not the sound of the door being forced, or a voice calling out, or any of the dramatic machinery she might have imagined in the long hours of the night. There was the sound of a single knuckle striking the door once, quietly, almost gently, in the way you knock when you already know someone is there. And a voice, low and even, said through the wood that she should stand away from the door. Natalya stepped back. She looked at the door and at the thin line of light beneath it, and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and she breathed, and she thought, with a precision that surprised her, that whatever came through that door next was not rescue. Not yet. Rescue was too simple a word for something this complicated. Whatever came next was a beginning, and beginnings in her experience were rarely clean. But she had been in the dark long enough. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin and stood in the centre of the cold attic floor and waited with everything she had left. The lock gave way, and the door opened, and the man who filled the frame of it looked at her for a long moment in the thin light of the landing candle, and what moved across his face was not pity, which she had braced herself for, and not surprise, which she had expected, but something quieter and more serious than either. He looked at her the way you look at something that confirms what you already suspected. Behind him, on the landing, Serafina stood absolutely still, and for the first time in Natalya's memory, her sister had nothing to say. No one moved for a long moment. The candle on the landing threw unsteady light across the three of them, and the shadows shifted and settled, and the house around them made none of its usual sounds, as though it too had paused to see what would happen next. Natalya stood in the centre of the attic floor and looked at the man in the doorway, and did not allow herself to look at her sister, because she knew that if she looked at Serafina now, she would lose the particular quality of stillness she had worked very hard to maintain, and she could not afford to lose it. Not yet. Not here. Not in front of him. He was taller than she had estimated from the crack in the boards. That was the first thing she registered with any clarity, because her mind was doing the thing it did under pressure, breaking everything into its smallest components, cataloguing details with a detachment that had gotten her through worse moments than this one. Tall, dark coat, travel-worn, but well-made. A face that was not handsome in the conventional sense, not the smooth and symmetrical handsomeness of men who had grown up knowing they were looked at, but something more irregular and more interesting. A jaw with some history in it, eyes that were doing in this moment exactly what she suspected they did in every moment, which was observe without announcing that they were observing. He was looking at her the way she was looking at him, taking inventory. She became aware, in the same moment, of what he was seeing. A woman in a dress that had once been green and was now something closer to grey, with 43 nights of attic dust worked into the fabric. Hair that had not been properly dressed since November. Hands with the knuckles still faintly marked from the weeks she had spent hitting the door. She was thin in a way that would be visible even under the dress, the particular thinness of someone who had been fed just enough to prevent a specific outcome. She did not look away from him. She had nothing left to be ashamed of. It was Serafina who spoke first, which was predictable, because Serafina could not survive silence, and this particular silence was the most dangerous one she had ever stood inside. Her voice came from behind the Duke's left shoulder, and it was extraordinary, Natalya thought. Even now, even in this moment, how quickly her sister had rebuilt the composure. The crack was gone. The brightness was back, slightly different in texture than before, warmer and more sorrowful, the voice of a woman about to offer a tragic explanation. She said that Natalya had not been well. She said it with tremendous gentleness. She said that the family had been deeply worried, that a physician had been consulted, that this arrangement had been made for Natalya's own protection and comfort, that it had been a very difficult autumn for all of them. She said the word fragile. She said the word episodes. She placed each word with the care of someone laying stones across uncertain ground, building a path toward a version of events that had Serafina at its centre as a devoted and suffering sister rather than what she was. Natalya listened to all of it without speaking. When Serafina finished, there was a pause, and the Duke still had not turned around. He was still looking at Natalya. And he said, without inflection, without any particular emphasis, that he would like to hear from her directly. Not from her sister. From her. Something moved in Natalya's chest. Something she did not fully trust yet. A small and cautious warmth that she kept at a distance, because warmth had cost her before, and she was not ready to spend it carelessly. She looked at him, and she thought about what to say, and she decided, as she had decided about the single word through the doorframe, that simplicity was the only tool worth using. She told him her name. She told him how long she had been in the room. She told him about the morning of the 14th of November, standing on the east balcony with her sister, looking at the frost on the garden hedges. She did not dramatize it. She used the same voice she had found in the attic, the one that had been refined by weeks of solitude into something without ornamentation, just the sequence of events in the order they had occurred, laid out with the steadiness of someone who has had a very long time to decide how they would tell this story if they were ever given the chance. She heard Serafina begin to speak behind him, and he raised one hand, just slightly, and the speaking stopped. That small gesture told Natalya more about him than anything else she had observed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked one question. He asked whether anyone else in the household knew. She told him that she believed most of them did. He turned around then, for the first time since the door had opened, and he looked at Serafina. Natalya had imagined this moment, in various forms, over the 43 nights. She had imagined shouting. She had imagined the particular cold pleasure of watching Serafina be disbelieved by someone she could not charm. She had imagined many things, and none of them had prepared her for the reality of it, which was quiet and surgical, and in some ways more devastating than anything loud would have been. He did not accuse her. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Serafina with an expression that contained nothing hostile, nothing theatrical, and he told her that he would be sending for his own physician tonight and his own solicitor in the morning, and that he would require a full accounting of the arrangements made in this household over the past 6 weeks, and that she should not leave the estate. He said it the way you say something that is not a threat, because it does not need to be. Serafina's face underwent something Natalya watched with a kind of distant fascination. She watched her sister understand, in real time, that the tools she had always used, the warmth, the management, the careful construction of other people's reality, were not going to work here. Not on this man, not tonight. What replaced the understanding was something Natalya had never seen on her sister's face before. It was very close to fear. Serafina turned to her then, and the look she gave her was not the blank and closed look from the balcony. This one had something in it, something complicated and compressed and too layered to name in a single word. It might have been the beginning of regret. It might have been fury at being caught. It might have been, underneath all of it, the look of a woman who had simply gone too far and knew it, and had no architecture left for that knowledge. Natalya looked back at her and felt nothing she had expected to feel. She had expected relief. She had expected the particular vicious satisfaction of a woman who has been wronged and is finally being witnessed. She had expected, if she was honest, the desire to say something, to name what had been done to her in plain language in front of someone with the power to act on it. Instead, she felt tired. A tiredness so deep it had no bottom to it. A tiredness that was not about the cold or the hunger or the 43 nights, but about the years before them, about every small erosion and every overlooked slight. And every morning she had woken in this house and quietly recalibrated herself to survive it. The Duke stepped back and gestured, briefly, toward the door. He said that she should come out now. She moved toward the door, and Serafina did not step aside immediately, and for one compressed and dangerous second, the landing was very crowded with everything that had happened between the two of them, all 22 years of it, present and heavy and unresolved. Natalya stopped. She looked at her sister from a distance of perhaps 2 feet, and she felt the weight of the choice in front of her clearly. She could say the thing she had rehearsed in the dark. She could say all of it. She had versions of it that were precise, and versions that were devastating, and versions that were simply true. She said none of them. She stepped past her sister without a word, and walked out of the attic and onto the landing and into the light of the candle, and she stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, because the light, even thin as it was more than she had had in a long time. She heard the Duke dismiss the 2 servants who had appeared at the top of the stairs, heard him instruct someone to prepare a room and bring something warm, heard the household begin to reorganize itself around his authority with the speed of people who had been waiting, perhaps, for someone to tell them what to do. She opened her eyes. He was standing a few feet away, giving instructions to the housekeeper in a low voice, and she studied his profile in the candlelight and thought about the question she had not yet let herself ask. Why he was here, not in the house generally, specifically. What had brought a man of his position to this estate on this night, a man whose name she had never heard, arriving without announcement in a carriage that made the household afraid? He had not explained himself. He had come upstairs and broken a lock, and sent her sister to silence with a look, and organized the household in the space of 10 minutes, and he had not once offered a reason for any of it. She thought about that. She thought about the fact that he had asked only one question, and that the question had not been about her well-being, or the particulars of her injury, or anything personal at all. It had been about witnesses. That was not the question of a man who had stumbled onto a situation and responded to it out of ordinary human decency. That was the question of a man who was already building something. She looked at him, and he turned, as though he had felt her looking, and their eyes met for the second time on the landing, and she held it this time, held the look steadily, because she was not the woman who looked away, had never been that woman, even when it would have been easier. He said her name, not the family name, her given name, Natalya. And the way he said it meant he had known it before he walked through the door, which meant he had known she was here, which meant that his arrival tonight was not coincidence. None of this was coincidence. She looked at him, and the tiredness was still there, but underneath it something else had shifted, something that had been lying dormant in the long dark weeks. Some part of her that was neither grateful nor frightened, but simply awake. She asked him, very quietly, what he had come for. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said that was a conversation better had downstairs, by a fire, after she had eaten something. It was not an answer, but it was the first time in 43 nights that anyone had suggested she deserved warmth before explanation, and she found, to her own surprise, that she could not argue with it. She followed him down the stairs, and behind them, on the landing, Serafina stood alone in the dark, and did not move. The fire in the downstairs sitting room was the first warm thing she had been close to in 43 nights. She sat in the chair nearest to it, and felt the heat move across her face and hands, and she did not speak for a moment, because she was doing something she had not permitted herself in the attic, which was simply feeling the contrast, the difference between what had been and what was now. She let herself feel it fully, not with gratitude, not yet, but with the precision of someone cataloguing damage. This is what cold does over time. This is what its absence feels like. This is what a fire is worth when you have been without one long enough. A tray was brought, bread and broth and something warm in a cup that smelled of cloves, and she ate slowly, the way she had taught herself to eat in the attic when food came, without urgency. Because urgency was a form of need she had decided not to display in front of anyone. The Duke sat across from her and did not rush her. That was the second thing she noticed about him. The first had been the authority. This was different. This was a man who understood that some silences should not be filled, and he sat in his chair with his long hands resting on his knees and watched the fire and waited with a patience that did not feel like performance. When she had eaten enough, she set the cup down and looked at him and said that she would like the explanation now. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said that his name was Alexander Volnerak, Duke of Ashenvael, and that he had come to Vorrenskaya Hall tonight because he had spent the better part of 3 weeks trying to locate her. She said nothing. She waited. He said that the arrangement between her father and Casimir Drevech had not been the only arrangement her father had made. That some years ago, in a period of financial difficulty that her father had taken considerable care to conceal from his household, a separate agreement had been entered into. An agreement that involved a sum of money significant enough to resolve the difficulty entirely, provided against a future consideration. She felt something shift in her chest. She kept her face still. He said that the consideration had been her. That her father, when she was 17 years old, had entered into an agreement with the Ashenvael estate, the specifics of which she had never been told, because the men involved had decided, in the way men decided such things, that she did not need to be. The fire crackled. She thought about being 17. She thought about the year her father had been unusually tense for several months, and then unusually relaxed, as though something heavy had been lifted, and she had attributed it, at the time, to business. She had been 17, and she had attributed it to business, and she had gone back to her books and thought nothing more of it. She asked him, with perfect steadiness, what the consideration was. He said it was marriage. The words sat between them in the warm room, and she looked at it the way you look at something you need to assess before you decide how to respond to it. She had been bartered. She had been bartered at 17, without her knowledge, by a man who had called her his more capable daughter, and meant it as a compliment he assumed made everything else acceptable. She had been bartered, and then someone else had pushed her off a balcony and locked her in an attic, and the man who held the agreement had taken 3 weeks to find her, and now he was sitting across from her in her own family's sitting room, telling her this over broth and firelight. She said, quietly, that she was not going to marry a stranger. He said that he was not asking her to. She looked at him. He said that when he had first understood what the agreement contained, he had come to discuss it with her father with the intention of dissolving it. He said that arrangements made without a woman's knowledge or consent were not arrangements he considered binding, regardless of what had been signed or by whom. He said he had come to tell her that, and to ensure she knew that no claim would be made on her on the basis of a contract she had never agreed to. She had prepared herself for many things sitting in the attic. She had not prepared herself for this. She looked at him for a long time, and the fire shifted and threw new light across his face, and she thought about what it cost a man, in his position, to say what he had just said. To come to a house and dissolve an agreement that was entirely in his favour, an agreement that gave him something, and to do it not because he was forced to, but because he thought it was right. She thought about how unusual that was, how rare, how completely and entirely at odds with every lesson the world had ever taught her about what men did with power when they had it. She asked him why. He said because she had not chosen it. 3 words, simple and complete, and carrying more weight than most speeches she had sat through in drawing rooms across 3 counties. because she had not chosen it, as though that settled the matter, as though that was reason enough on its own without further elaboration. She looked at the fire. She thought about Serafina upstairs on the landing, and her father somewhere in this house, having been told by now that something had happened, something he would need to account for, and she thought about the 43 nights and everything they had taken from her. The weight of it was real. She could feel it sitting on her chest, the way the cold had sat on her chest in the attic, heavy and patient and not interested in her preferences. But she was also thinking about the man across from her, and the 3 weeks he had spent looking for her, and the lock he had broken, and the one question he had asked on the landing about witnesses, the question of a man who was already building something, already thinking beyond the immediate moment, toward consequence and accountability, and what could be proven and what could be done with proof. She asked him what happened now. He said that was up to her. She felt something catch in her chest at that, something small and sharp, up to her. She could not remember the last time anyone in this house had told her something was up to her. She could not remember the last time she had been offered a choice by someone who did not also have a preferred answer they were waiting for her to arrive at. She said that she wanted Serafina held accountable. He said that she would be. She said she wanted it done properly, not managed, not quieted with money, or explained away with the kind of careful language that turned crimes into misfortunes and left everyone involved with their reputations intact. She wanted it documented and witnessed and real. He said that his solicitor was already on his way, and that he had 2 footmen who had heard her through the door, and a housekeeper who had known about the lock from the beginning, and who was, now that the balance of power in the household had shifted, very willing to speak about what she knew. She thought about that, about the way he had already been assembling it before she asked, about the 3 weeks of looking, and the question about witnesses, and the solicitor already summoned. She thought about what it meant that he had walked into this house tonight, not just to find her, but prepared to act on what he found. She said, carefully, that he had come here expecting something worse than what he found. He said he had not known what he would find. He had known only that she was missing, and that the explanation he had been given did not hold together under examination. She asked who had told him she was missing. He said, Casimir Drevech. She absorbed that. Casimir, who had been taken from her by her sister, who had believed or perhaps pretended to believe the story of the quiet departure, and then at some point had stopped believing it, or had perhaps never fully believed it, and had gone to the one person with enough authority to do something about it. She felt the complicated architecture of that settle over her and did not know what to do with it yet. She looked at the Duke and said that she did not know what to do with any of this. She said it plainly, without apology, because she had spent 43 nights being precise, and she saw no reason to stop now. She said that she was grateful, and that she was also angry, and that she was also exhausted in a way that went beyond the body, and that she did not know how to feel about a man who had come to dissolve an agreement she had never consented to, and who had done so with such matter-of-fact decency that she could not find a single place to put her suspicion. He said that she did not have to know what to do with it tonight. She said that was an easy thing to say. He said it was the true thing, which was more important than whether it was easy. She looked at him and felt the shift again, the same one that had moved through her on the landing when he had said her name, not the tiredness now, but the thing underneath it. The part of her that had survived 43 nights, not by going numb, but by staying, against all reasonable advice from the quieter parts of herself, awake. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said that she would like to stay in this house tonight. Not because she felt safe in it, she did not, but because she was not going to be the one who left. She had already been made to disappear once, and she was not going to do it again on anyone else's terms. He said that was reasonable. She said that tomorrow she wanted to be present when the solicitor came. He said that she would be. She said that she also wanted to speak to her father herself before anyone else did. He looked at her for a moment at that, and she saw in his face the first trace of something that was not the neutral and careful expression he had worn since the door, something that was almost concern, the kind that does not announce itself, but sits quietly in the line of the jaw and the steadiness of the gaze. He said that he thought that was her right. She said she knew it was. She was not asking his permission. She was informing him of her intention. Something moved in his expression, not a smile, exactly. Something quieter and more internal than a smile. He looked at her the way, she thought, you look at someone who has just confirmed something you had already begun to suspect about them. The fire burned low between them. She was not safe. She understood that. The house above her still contained her sister and her father, and 43 nights of unresolved consequence, and tomorrow would be hard in ways she could not fully anticipate, and the man across from her was still a stranger, with his own reasons for being here that she had not yet fully mapped. But she was out of the attic. She was warm, and for the first time since the morning of the 14th of November, she was sitting in a room where the door was open and no one had locked it behind her. She looked at the fire and breathed, and let that be enough for now. She did not sleep well. That was not a surprise. She had not expected to sleep well in a bed with clean sheets, in a room with a door she could open from the inside, had not expected her body to simply release 43 nights of learned vigilance because the circumstances had changed. The body does not work that way. It keeps its own records, and it does not close them just because the mind has been given a reason to. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, and catalogued its sounds the way she had catalogued them from the attic, and the sounds were the same, the old timber settling, the wind at the east-facing windows, the distant movement of a servant in the early hours, but they meant different things now. They were the sounds of a house she was in, rather than a house she was beneath, and that difference, small as it seemed, was the difference between everything. She thought about her father. She had asked to speak to him herself, and she had meant it, and she still meant it. But in the quiet of the room, she let herself feel the full weight of what that conversation would require. Her father was not a cruel man. She had never been able to call him cruel, and she could not call him cruel now, which was in some ways harder than if she could. Cruel men were simple. You understood what they were, and you adjusted accordingly. Her father was something more complicated. He was a man who loved his daughters in the way certain men love things they consider valuable, with genuine feeling and with genuine blindness to the difference between love and ownership. He had sold her future at 17 and called it protection. He had heard that she had gone quietly to the country and returned to his newspaper. He had done both of these things without malice and without awareness, and that was the part she did not know how to hold. She was still angry. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She was not in a forgiving place yet, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise was the old way of doing things, and she had left the old way of doing things on the attic floor. But she also understood, in the deep and unsentimental part of herself that the last 43 nights had built, that the conversation with her father was not about forgiveness. It was about truth, about saying the thing plainly, in daylight, in a room with a door she could leave through, with no performance and no management and no softening of the edges. She was going to tell him what had been done to her, and she was going to tell him that she knew about the agreement at 17, and she was going to do it in the clear and level voice she had found in the dark. And whatever he did with that was his responsibility and not hers. She had carried enough that was not hers. She rose before the household was properly awake, and dressed in the clothes that had been left for her, a plain morning dress from her own wardrobe that someone had retrieved, and she went to the window and looked out at the garden in the early light. The frost was still on the hedges, the same frost, or frost that looked like it, pale and indifferent on the dark green, and she looked at it and thought about the morning of the 14th of November when her sister had pointed at it and said something about the cold, and she let herself feel the full grief of that moment, not the fall, not the attic, but the moment before, when she had stood beside her sister and looked at the frost and not known. She let herself feel it, and then she set it down. Not because it did not matter, because she was not going to carry it into every room for the rest of her life. The solicitor arrived with the early morning coach. His name was Brevnikov, a thin and precise man, with the careful movements of someone who had spent a lifetime handling things that could break, and he came with a travelling case and an expression of professional neutrality that did not quite conceal, at least not from Natalya, a certain grim satisfaction at the nature of the work ahead. She liked him immediately. She was present, as she had said she would be, when he sat down at the writing table in the study. The Duke was there also, standing near the window in the grey morning light, and she was aware of him in the peripheral way. She had been aware of him since the landing, that constant low-level consciousness of where he was in a room, which she was still deciding what to do with. Her father came in last. He looked older than she remembered. That was the first thing. He had aged in 6 weeks, in the way people age, when something has been eating at them in the night, and she looked at his face and saw in it, before he had said a single word, that he had known, not everything, not the attic, but that the story of the quiet departure had been wrong, and that he had chosen, in the way he chose things, he did not want to examine, not to press it. He saw her, and something moved across his face that was real and unmanaged and complicated, relief and guilt and the particular shame of a man who has understood too late that understanding late is still a choice. She did not go to him. She sat in the chair across from Brevnikov's table, and she looked at her father, and she said, in the clear and level voice she had prepared, that she was going to tell him what had happened in this house over the past 6 weeks, and that she needed him to listen without interrupting, and that when she was finished, they would discuss what came next. He sat down. He listened. She told him everything, not with anger, not with tears, with the same stripped-down precision she had used on the landing, the same voice that had no ornamentation, because ornamentation was a luxury, and she had learned to live without luxuries. She watched his face as she spoke, and she watched the colour leave it and return, and leave again, and she watched the moment when he understood about the attic, the specific moment. She could see it move through him like something physical, and she kept speaking, because she had not come this far to stop. When she finished, there was a long silence. Her father said her name. She waited. He said that he had not known. He said it the way a man says something he knows is insufficient and says it anyway, because it is the only true thing available to him. He said that he had wondered and had not asked, and he said that he was sorry in the plain and broken way of a man who has run out of the kind of language that makes things easier. She looked at him for a long moment. She said that she knew he had not known about the attic. She said she also knew that he had made an agreement about her future when she was 17 without telling her, and that he had believed a story about her departure that he had not examined, because examining it would have required him to act, and that both of those things were true at the same time as his not knowing, and that she needed him to hold all of it together rather than finding the one exculpatory piece and retreating into it. Her father looked at his hands. He said she was right. She had not expected that. She had prepared for defense and deflection and the particular maneuver of men who feel accused, which was to reframe the accusation as a misunderstanding until it became one. She had not prepared for him to simply say she was right, and the simplicity of it did something to the hard and careful architecture she had built around herself, not dismantling it, but shifting it slightly, making a small amount of room. Serafina was brought in after. She came in composed. Natalya had to give her that. She came in with her hands still and her chin level, and the expression of a woman who had spent the night preparing her position and believed it was defensible. She looked at Brevnikov, and she looked at the Duke, and she did not look at Natalya. Natalya looked at her. She looked at her sister, and she felt the complicated, layered thing that 43 nights had not resolved, and a single morning could not resolve either. The love that had never quite left, because love like that does not simply leave. It becomes something else, something damaged and changed in shape, but still present in the way that scars are present, marking the place where something real had been. She felt that, and she also felt the clear and unambiguous knowledge of what had been done to her, and she held both without trying to reconcile them, because they did not reconcile, they simply coexisted, and that was something she was going to have to learn to carry. She did not speak to Serafina. She let Brevnikov do what he had come to do, which he did with the quiet efficiency of a man who has prepared thoroughly and needs no assistance. There were questions, there were answers that shifted under examination. There was a moment when Serafina's composure finally broke, not dramatically, not with tears or raised voices, just a small and visible fracturing around the eyes. The look of a person who has understood that the story they built is not going to hold. By mid-morning it was done, or done enough. The formal proceedings would take longer. Brevnikov was clear about that. These things moved at their own pace through the appropriate channels, and Natalya would need to make herself available, and she should expect it to be uncomfortable in the ways that such processes were always uncomfortable for the person who had been wronged, which was one of the more reliable injustices of the system. But it was moving, it was real, it was documented and witnessed, and could not now be quietly absorbed. She walked out of the study and into the corridor and stood for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes closed and breathed. She heard him before she opened her eyes. The particular weight of his footstep, which she had already learned without meaning to. He stopped a few feet away and did not speak, which she had also learned was characteristic of him, this willingness to be present without demanding that the presence be acknowledged. She opened her eyes. She said that she did not know what happened next. He said that was all right. She said that she meant practically, where she went, what she did. The agreement was dissolved. Her position in this house was not one she intended to maintain. She had the dress she was standing in and a wardrobe upstairs and very little else that was straightforwardly hers. He said that there were options and that none of them needed to be decided today. She looked at him and thought about the weeks ahead and the proceedings and the slow and unglamorous work of rebuilding a life that had been methodically taken apart. And she thought about doing that work alone, which she was prepared to do. She had always been prepared to do difficult things alone, and she thought about the alternative, which was less clear and more complicated, and involved a man she had known for less than a day, who had nonetheless already changed the direction of everything. She said, carefully, that she did not know what he wanted from her. She said she understood what he had told her, that the agreement was dissolved, that no claim would be made, and she believed him. But she also understood that he had spent 3 weeks looking for her and had come to this house with a solicitor already summoned, and had broken a lock and reorganized a household, and she would be a fool to think all of that was purely abstract principle with nothing personal in it at all. He looked at her for a long moment. He said that she was not a fool. She waited. He said that what he wanted, if she was asking him plainly, was the opportunity to know her, not to claim her, not to collect on anything, to know her. He said that he had spent 3 weeks trying to find a woman he had never met, and in that time had learned enough about her from the people who knew her to understand that she was someone he would like to sit across a table from more than once in better circumstances than these. She thought about that. She thought about the fire last night and the patience and the 3 words, because she had not chosen it. And she thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who had looked deliberately rather than accidentally. She said that she thought that could be managed, not warmly, not with the rushed relief of someone who has been rescued, with the careful and considered tone of a woman who knows her own worth and is willing to extend a precise and limited and revisable amount of trust to someone who has so far done nothing to waste it. He understood the difference. She could see that he did. Outside the corridor window, the frost was beginning to lift from the garden hedges. The pale morning light was doing what pale morning light does when it is given enough time, which is to make things visible that the dark had kept hidden. The colour in the stone, the shape of the bare branches, the long shadow of the gateposts at the end of the drive casting themselves thin and dark across the gravel. She looked at it and thought about the crack in the boards and the 43 nights and the single word she had pressed through the gap in the doorframe into the cold dark air, not knowing if it would carry, not knowing who it would reach. It had carried. It had reached exactly the right person. She did not know yet what that meant. She did not know what was coming, or how hard the coming months would be, or whether the careful and limited trust she had just extended would prove to be well placed. She did not know any of the things that people want to know before they step forward. She stepped forward anyway, because the dark was behind her now, and the door, this time, was hers to open. If you're still with me till this end, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. I truly appreciate you for sticking till the end. I hope you enjoyed every bit of the story. I will be there in the comments.